Hey YouTube, today we're going to talk about the Shawnee Minisync archaeological site. Now the historical marker is there, it's near this bike park, and there's also a frisbee golf site over there, course over there. The archaeological site, I don't think it's right here. There's the marker, I read online that this isn't really where the archaeological site is. They actually put the marker for the site somewhere away from the actual archaeological site because they didn't want people digging it up and looking for artifacts, which makes sense. But that does make my job a little harder here. I don't exactly know where this archaeological site is, so I can't really tell you, but I do know that somewhere in this general vicinity, could be half a mile that way, could be half a mile this way, who knows, somewhere around here there's an archaeological site. Now I do have some clues about where this location might be. So I basically know, I read online that there were several hearths found from this Paleo-Indian site, and the hearths were covered in a layer of sand because we're near the Delaware River. The Delaware River is just over here, and the Delaware River has flooded many times throughout history. And because the hearths were covered in sand, the archaeologists know that I figured out that it has to be within the floodplain of the Delaware River. So what I'm going to do is, this is like a little dirt bike course. There's a frisbee golf course here as well. I'm gonna walk through the frisbee golf course to the very end and then into the woods and see if we can get close to the Delaware River, the edge of the water. And while I do that, I'll tell you a little bit more about Minisync. So where we're heading is somewhere back in there. I want to see if there's a trail or an entrance, a path to the Delaware River, which is about a quarter mile that way. Now, you know what I always say about where Indian villages are located. They're often located right where one body of water meets another body of water, right? So this village is where the Broadhead Creek meets the Delaware River. Broadhead Creek is a major creek and it empties into the Delaware River. And so over the course of thousands of years, Native Americans figured out that that's a really good place to put a village, and they did so, Have we found our trail? Alright, let's see where this trail goes. There looks to be what might be like an old train trestle track here, so I'm not sure. I think there used to be a bridge over the Delaware River right here, and so this might be an old road or an old train line to that bridge. But let's see where this path goes. Alright, now I want to try to explain the significance of Minisync as a region. I'm currently at the southern part of the Delaware Water Gap region. The Delaware Water Gap is a national park, but it's also a wider area around the national park, and it's basically coextensive with an ancient region called the Minisync region. And Minisync is basically an ancient collection of villages. It was a series of villages and settlements that were occupied by Native Americans for literally 10,000 years. This sign back there says 13,000 years. And what that means is that Minisync was one of the most important locations in the region of New Jersey, northern Pennsylvania, and southern New York. There's a deer. Okay, so we see the deer. The ancients are here. Whenever I see wildlife, I tend to think that the ancients who lived here are watching us, watching over us, or the great spirit of the Lenape are watching over us. Now, I think what I'm trying to say about Minisync is that it's not just one village. It's not just one settlement. It's a massive complex of settlements. And I've researched a bit online about Minisync. And the whole Delaware Valley and about 20 miles either side of the Delaware River were populated by a group of Native Americans who were all connected. They all were one sort of settlement, one grouping of people, which means that together they can be thought of as the same group, right? And one of the things that makes that important is that we can then start to estimate population sizes based on the sizes of these villages. One of the estimations of the population size of these villages, this collection of settlements that I've seen online, is over 20,000 people. There were potentially over 20,000 people living in this area of the Minisync region. And oh, there are the deer again. I don't know if you can see them through the brush. But 20,000 people is a lot of people. And to me, that signifies that this area was almost, I would call it a proto-urban environment. You know, you can just imagine if there's a landscape that's the size of the upper Delaware River, the Delaware Water Gap, it would make sense. And there were 20,000 people living in that area. It's sort of equivalent to a suburb, a modern suburb, almost. And in ancient times, it absolutely would have been a major hub of activity, because it's unusual to have 20,000 people living in such close proximity to each other. And I think of that as basically like a city, of an ancient town, at least, an ancient collection of loosely governed villages that all were part of one settlement together. And that's why I sort of think of it as almost like a proto-urban center. So, you know, in a previous video, I covered the village at Raymond Kill Run. And Raymond's Kill Run village was part of the Minisync conglomeration of villages, the Minisync area. And that village dated to over 10,000 years ago. And across from that village, across the Delaware, was an island called Minisync Island. And Minisync Island was inhabited, both sides of it. And across from many village sites along the Delaware, there are other islands that were also inhabited. And then back up in the hinterland to the west of the Delaware River, along the Delaware Water Gap, in the hills near like Stroudsburg and that area, there were more villages that were part of the Minisync area, the Minisync regional collection of settlements. Gosh, this is getting a little This tall grass is making me a little nervous about snakes, but we'll keep going. And look, there's a chunk of the old bridge that used to be here. I want to get out there to the point. I will say though, as we walk towards the point, I'm walking on sand, which means we're in the flood zone. And knowing what we know about the ancient hearth that was discovered, that it was covered in sand, I think that makes sense to say at that point that we are standing basically where the ancient village would have been, or at least ancient peoples would have been here walking on this land as well at some point as they went to fish in the Delaware River. What is that? I don't want to touch that little... There are all sorts of things in the sand here. But let's keep going. Let's try to get out onto the gravel bars out there and see if we can find anything interesting. So, you know, Minisync had 20,000 people, which in ancient times, 10,000 years ago, was a significant settlement. 20,000 people is a significant population in the settlement. And, you know, it's an hour away from New York City, which is just on the coast. It's an hour, maybe an hour and a half, depending on how you drive. Maybe 2 hours if there's traffic. And I think it's not a coincidence that 10,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago, according to the sign, there were 20,000 people living here, and now one of the greatest cities on earth is located just an hour away, just an hour that way. Wow, look at that chunk of the old bridge. The river goes there and goes around this point and then out that way. I'm now walking on river rocks, and you can see most of these rocks are this argillite, and argillite is perfect for making stone tools because it shatters in a very predictable way, and it shatters in concave patterns as if it's made of glass. You know, different rocks don't shatter. A lot of rocks just crumble when you break them. But the importance of argillite is the fact that it shatters, like flint, it shatters, and that allows you to make very sharp edges with this rock. If you know how to work it and you practice, you can make very sharp knives and other working tools using argillite. And that's exactly what the Native Americans did. They used this kind of rock to make their knives and their stone tools, scrapers, and other sorts of, implements, rock implements. So I'll take a look around at the ground here for a bit, and I'll see if I find any ancient tools. I'm not sure I will, but it's always worth a shot. After all, there have been people living here for 13,000 years, so it stands to reason over that time one of them would have dropped something, and maybe it's still here after all the floods. So let's see. Yeah, look at this. A tiny shell. So small. Maybe a snail shell. Looks like a snail shell. There are some really interesting cores of argillite. I think this is a core of argillite. Someone who knows more about rocks, let me know what this is. But it's very interesting to see the rocks because it indicates that this is a good area for finding stone tools. Look at this rock with little hole in it. What is that? That could be man-made. What is that little hole? Let me know in the comments if you have a guess if that's a stone tool of some sort. That hole is very unusual. So, let me know in the comments. Now, one thing I'm also seeing a lot of are these mussels. There are all kinds of mussels on this beach, and the Native Americans who lived here for thousands of years definitely ate mussels. This was a major part of their diet, was shellfish of some sort. Maybe not that species, I'm not sure, but definitely they would have eaten shellfish. What is this? Is that a worked edge? Hard to tell. Yeah, interesting. I'm also finding a lot of brick, a lot of industrial materials. And presumably that's because that's a huge chunk of an old bridge that used to go all the way across straight over to there. It's hard to see, but there's on the other side of the river, there's another chunk of the bridge. So I'm actually standing in quite an industrial area, and that might also be partly why I'm not having much luck finding anything ancient. The old bridge. This was an old bridge ran across over there. Now all that's left are the piers that held the trackway or the roadway. I see some people fishing. Man, there's something almost post-apocalyptic about seeing this here, you know? For 13,000 years, people lived here, and then another civilization came and built this bridge. And now all that's left of the bridge are these pylons. It's very interesting. History, layers and layers and layers of history on top of each other. You know, one civilization builds on what the previous civilization left behind. So while I look around on the beach around this old bridge, I'll cut to the future and show you what I know about Minisync. Hey, Future Sean here. All right, let's go over this site. So it has a Wikipedia page. Minisync is a general region, right? And I think what I was trying to say, that I didn't really quite articulate it in the best way possible, but I was trying to say that this area in the ancient times was a large complex of villages. Archaeologists use the word complex. And the word I was searching for that I didn't quite land on was society. This was like a society, a cohesive group of people that had a shared culture through time. And it was probably many societies, or at least one society that evolved in many ways, right? So you can see here's New York City. This is northwest of New York City is the Delaware Water Gap. And I was down here in East Stroudsburg. And if you zoom in, well, let me zoom in on East Stroudsburg a little bit first so you can see. This is the bottom of the Delaware Water Gap. Here's Stroudsburg, and then over here's the Delaware River, and you can see there are quite a number of waterways that come together right around here. There are a few islands in the Delaware River. The Delaware River takes a big turn right where Broadhead Creek meets the Delaware River, and it's in this area where Broadhead Creek meets the Delaware River that the Shawnee Minisync archaeological site was found. So that was a very important place. And when I visited it, I showed up here. Here's where the historic marker is, up on the high ground above Broadhead Creek. And then this is the the frisbee golf course that I was showing. And I kind of walked down into this frisbee golf course and then back into the woods here and over to the river. And the area I was walking around in is actually submerged in this overhead shot. But I was walking around on these flats where the Native Americans would have gone fishing. And I'll show you a paper in a moment. You can see that there are these houses here that have been built along the Delaware River. Here's Broadhead Creek coming in. And the archaeological site is actually back in these woods. And I found that out because of a paper I'll show you in a second. But this is all private property, so you can't access it. Even if I had wanted to access it, I wouldn't have been allowed to. But this is sort of where in these woods back up here on the high ground is above the floodplain of the Delaware River is where the archaeological site was found. And this is a paper that I found for you, just describing the site and some of the archaeological work that's been done there. It's called Down to the Seeds and the Stones, a new look at subsistence remains from Shawnee Minisync. Now, this paper is pretty much trying to discuss and describe a problem. Basically, there's a debate among archaeologists whether the Paleo Indians who lived at this site 13,000 years ago were there permanently, subsistence, or whether they were migratory. And there's this ongoing idea that Clovis people, when they were basically, specialist subsistence specialists or generalists, right? So there's this idea that Clovis people hunted extinct megafauna like mastodons and large ground sloths and stuff like that, which no longer exist. And instead, they focused on the large, like spearing the large mastodons instead of gathering seeds and nuts and farming and developing agriculture. So this paper is sort of investigating that because at the site there were a lot of hawthorn seeds found. So I'll show you the impact of that. If you scroll through the site, you can see it shows an inset of the location of the site. Here is Broadhead. This is Broadhead Creek coming into the Delaware River, and this is where I was showing you that patch of woods above the houses where the hearths were found. And that's really what they found. They found these hearth features under a bunch of sand. And that's interesting because we'll skip through here. These are some Clovis points. You can see the distinctive fluting of the Clovis points. And then there were a bunch of hearths found. This is the main hearth this picture is amazing. Look at this. So you can see that there is a layer of charcoal here, and then above the charcoal is more sand. And what that means is the river actually did flood over the hearth over time, over thousands of years, burying it under layers of sand. And the stratification of sand layers allows for some dating of the hearth that was here. And this is just like, look at that. It's incredible. So there were Indians having fires there 13,000 years ago. Now this table is also interesting because I was searching for a date. On the historical marker it says 13,000 years ago, so I wanted to verify that. And then there's this table. It's sideways, so I flipped it so we can read it more easily here. But you can see it's a table of radiocarbon ages from Shawnee Minisync, and these are samples that have been taken over time since the excavations at this site over time have happened since the 1970s. It's been excavated several times. So one of the things you can see is whenever you see radiocarbon dating, there's a date range given, right? And what that means is, so this first calibration is basically saying within, for some probability, which I think is 68%, 68% probability that the true age range of this sample is within these dates. So within 68% probability, these dates from Klein's sample in 1972 were from 12,900 to 12,050 years before present, BP. So that's 68% sure that it's 12,000 years ago. Now, if we go to the second calibration, that moves the window of time of estimation out. So it's a larger date range, but the probability that the true sample, age of the sample is in that range goes up to 95%. So this second calibration means that 95% certain that the sample was that old, somewhere in this range. Now that obviously the ranges are larger, but I noticed something. Look at this. There's one range here that I've highlighted that's 15,950 years ago to 9,950 years ago. So that's basically a 95% certain date range of 16,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, that this sample was somewhere in that range. Now that's a very wide range. That's about 6,000 year range. And that's probably because this alkali fraction of charcoal, it was soil that was stained with charcoal. So it's not a great sample. It's not a very easily datable sample. It's sort of low quality, but still, I mean, this puts, we're not saying, I don't think any archaeologists would agree that this is saying that the site is 16,000 years old, but it brings up the possibility that it could be 16,000 years old. Very small chance, very small probability. More likely, with 68% probability, we can guess that it's 14,000 to 11,000 years old. Now, if you look at the rest of the samples, you'll see dates 12,895. That's, call it 13,000 years ago. 13,000, 12,900, 13,040, 13,030. So all the rest of the dates at various probabilities are closer to that 13,000 year old mark. But just, isn't it tantalizing to see almost 16,000 years ago as one of the possible dates in the date range? I just think that's really cool. So I wanted to point that out. If we scroll down through the paper, you see that a lot of these date ranges are coming from these hawthorn seeds and hickory nut shells that were charred. They were found charred in the hearths at this site. There were about three to five hearths that were discovered. And in each of the hearths, there were these burnt seeds and nuts. And that's what was used to come up with these radiocarbon dates. So that's interesting for two reasons. One is that it shows that potentially the Native Americans weren't just, the Clovis people at this site, they weren't just eating mastodon or fishing out of the river. There were a lot of fish bones found at this site too. They were also foraging, and potentially foraging in a controlled way that is a form of agriculture. We know that later Indians cultures grew the three sisters: corn, squash, and beans. Maybe the Paleo Indians were sort of gathering hawthorn seeds and hickory nuts in a controlled way that allowed them to have a sort of a subsistence level lifestyle there. So it wouldn't have been a transient hunting camp. It would have been a more permanent subsistence level agricultural society approaching that, right? So that's interesting. The other thing that makes it interesting to see these seeds and nuts is that it indicates that the forest that these Indians were living in was not as much of a boreal forest, but it was a more mixed forest full of different types of trees, which indicates that already the climate in Pennsylvania and New Jersey about 13,000 years ago was warmer than we might expect. But it just indicates that the glaciers had already receded northward from this point, and the climate was warming up, which means the trees were coming up from the south. Closer to the glacier, you'd expect to see white pine and boreal forest and trees that populate boreal forests, like today you would see in far northern Canada. But at this time, we're already seeing hickory trees, hawthorn trees, and that indicates a warmer climate, which is kind of cool to understand that the Clovis people were really moving into the landscape as the climate warmed up. So this is just a really interesting paper. You can look for it yourself. I just wanted to show you a bit of that. Let me see if there were any other cool pictures. No, maybe not. No more cool pictures. So we'll stick with this. But there were over 25,000 artifacts found at this site. There are really interesting there are other pictures you can find of that. I just think it just goes to show that we live in a really ancient landscape. Like when I say we live in an ancient landscape, I don't mean just a couple thousand years. I mean over 10,000 years, 13,000 years ago, and potentially, very small chance, but potentially 16,000 years old, 16,000 years ago, there were people living here. So thanks for watching. Just wanted to show that. Now back to the video. just caught my eye. What's that? It's a piece of shell, I guess. And then this little piece of pottery, white pottery of some sort. So that's the story of the Minisync area and this particular site from 13,000 years ago. The Clovis people lived here, and so yeah, this is, you know, the Shawnee Minisync archaeological site is somewhere back in those woods probably. And man, I feel the ancients. I do feel the ancients. I mean, it's a little tricky here because there's so much. There are houses right there, and a massive chunk of an old bridge right here. But you know, I don't see any birds, but I still feel the ancient presence of such a historic site. I mean, for 13,000 years people have lived here. Amazing, amazing. I wonder how many of these people who live in these houses, or any locals in this area, even know that for 13,000 years people have lived here, you know? It's crazy, crazy. So, yeah, that's the story. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you like these adventures where I go find ancient sites, please give me a like on this video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll certainly do more. And there's also an email list going with a newsletter in the description, so join the email list, and I've got memberships going. There's all sorts of stuff coming. I'm working on a lot of things, so yeah, stay tuned. And my name's Sean. This is my channel, It's All Good, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.